I'd like to thank everybody, including my peers, for the privilege of their company, and Professor Halberstam. I don't have a PowerPoint presentation, so I hope I don't bore you. But even if I did, I'd have to come up with something interesting to contend with plastic bull testicles and a wall with vaginas. I'll swing it as is, I suppose. So I'd like to begin by citing one of the great feminists of our time, Britney Spears, who hypnotically rouses us to give them a freak show. Now, my own attraction to this invitation, and no doubt I'm not alone in this, lies precisely in the desire for an encounter with the extraordinary. Judith Butler even gives such a desire for the outside normative value when she situates critique and critical imagination in relation to such encounters with the exceptional, the strange, or the freakish. While this may seem a strange horizon against which to begin an exposition on the limits of equivalency confronted by efforts to theorize gay male subjectivity through feminist discourse, my goal is to, from the outset, open this space to problematize this project. In other words, if the problem is a dissolution of the force of feminist descriptive and prescriptive or normative discourses when taken up by gay men, how does Britney's ventriloquial repetition expose the potential futility of a certain response to this dissolution or this limit of equivalence? The problem, of course, is that if we follow Foucault and Derrida, as I think Butler is careful to do, and theorize from an embedded position in a matrix or text which offers no outside, then we have ample reason to disabuse ourselves of the belief that any signifier possesses an internal, eternal, or enduring core, rendering it invulnerable to reappropriation, reassimilation, and redeployment. Britney's freak show as a point in case. Not even Butler's subversion of identity escapes embeddedness in the ventricle circulation of discourses, and thus perhaps seeking out a theoretical discourse through which to address the specificity of gay male subjectivity is itself misguided. Of course, certain attempts have been made to theorize gay male subjectivity in such a way as to resist reinscription, to my mind most seductively by Guy Hockingem in Homosexual Desire. However, Hockingem's effort relies on a strategy of negation. Under the influence of Deleuze's Anti-Oedipus and Foucault's History of Madness, economized and juridicized psychoanalysis is the foil over against which the homosexual emerges. Yet what emerges is precisely nothing but a deconstruction of an imaginary constitution of the homosexual governed by a medico-juridical Oedipal apparatus. Quote, homosexuality exists and does not exist at one and the same time. Indeed, its very mode of existence questions again and again the certainty of existence. Indeed, I would argue that Hockingem is in a certain sense closer to Butler in wishing to position homosexual men in an anal relation that emphasizes the annular circulation of desire and a subversion of stable identities. For Butler, drag affects this subversion, this subversive problematization, while for Hockingem, it is gay sex in all its manifold practices, group, public, anonymous, etc., etc. Often what gets lost in critiques of Butler is this emphasis on praxis as subjectivation. Her interest is in the deed, following Nietzsche's destruction of the theologico-groundological doer behind the deed. Yet what is equally lost is a sense of selfhood, a means of understanding desire and the practices thereof in terms other than transgression, that is, outside an affirmation of nothingness or negation. Here it is useful to cite David Halperin's reminder in What Do Gay Men Want? Quote, killing off psychology in such a context meant foreclosing all access to the category of gay subjectivity itself, bracketing it as an object of gay investigation, and making it impossible to ask, let alone answer the question, what do gay men want? Indeed, he continues, that was precisely the point, shifting attention away from the disquieting and potentially discreditable details of gay subjectivity. For Halperin, Foucault's attention to an emphasis of techniques or technologies of the self, practices that, as practiced, subjectivate an actor in certain sets of ethical relations, including reflexivity, For him, this offers a means by which to situate gay male subjectivity. And to a certain extent, I follow Halperin in placing emphasis on praxis, on practices, instead of looking for subjectivities per se, first and foremost, that is. Now, I should briefly summarize, and in so doing, sharpen the trajectory of my following remarks. If the quest for an outside, which Butler's theory of performativity and the strange may or may not be doing, is futile, if and only if this outside is figured as immune to insidious capillary recirculation, then the desire for a subject position that is definitively strange is simply a desire for reinscription within normalizing discourse. However, efforts analogous to negative theology or Sartrean existentialism, which locate freedom in nothingness, produce a very hollow account of subjectivity. The subject, in its resistance to hegemonic ideology, is inarticulable, dissolved. And here, subversion of norms is then coextensive with subversion of self, which leads, in my opinion, to an unsatisfying Kristeva-esque psychosis. Now, at this point, and returning to the promised topic of my paper, the limits of equivalence emerge. While all subjects share a common embeddedness within a normative matrix, and equally, if they want to at least, or if they try, all will experience the disorienting effects of transgressive resistance, what is unique is the response to such dissolution. My interest is not, however, to explore a philosophical framework for attempting to understand this, but rather in formulating a decidedly political frame through which to view gay male subjectivity in particular. Or, again, rather than attempt to solve the subject question, that is, trying to figure out what is a gay male subjectivity by looking for subjects, and I don't want to do this because, in my opinion, it would entail leaving an account of subjectivity that somehow manages to offer an escape to a stable subjectivity outside of coercive influence. I am interested in the practices that serve as punctuation marks, as it were, for a certain type of sociality. Now, crucially, the metaphor is loose. I'm not interested in critiquing the good or bad grammar of socio-political practices. My concern is, in first and foremost, identifying the ways in which certain social practices can be seen to structure the text of gay male life so as to, from there, make an evaluative move. Right? To say, then, that certain practices serve as the punctuation marks of a certain sociality is not terribly novel. Nor is it novel to insist on a text of sociality that is not cluttered or confused by an inordinate amount of grammatologics. This instead we call fashionable. Nevertheless, to discern practices potentially discrete to gay male subjectivity need not entail acquiescence to a demand for a second-order synthesis of those practices into first-order analytic frames, especially feminist or queer. And I single out queer here to the extent that it tends to focus on a politics of inclusion. So the main concern around a lot of queer politics is who's being left out. If we draw these lines, who are we leaving out? How can we make rapprochement to the people that will be excluded? And I'm saying, in some sense, that that's not necessarily the most productive way to think, first and foremost, about politics on the one hand, but also to think about trying to theorize a particular group of people on the other. We shouldn't be worried about who's being left out when we want to pay attention to one group of people. So here I would like to further sharpen my argument in two ways. First, I am calling for a certain sort of methodology, a sort of interpretivism, or a Foucauldian archaeology or a Nietzschean genealogy, with theoretical commitments that extend only to the point of positing the practices that comprise sociality to also be subject to interpretation, and that this interpretation is contingent on a literacy in the specific cultural discourses of that particular social network. That is, you can't talk about what you don't know or have some sense of understanding. This entails, no doubt, a certain degree of theoretical humility and implicitly carries an ethical imperative, barring the violence that always accompanies any imposition a priori of grand theoretical accounts, what I understand to be the postmodern project, and to an extent, the resistance to grand narrative accounts. Now, second, I would like to briefly offer a reading of Julia Kristeva. I choose Kristeva because she remains a powerful force in feminist theory, but also because she proposes a manner by which to read female subjectivity, the semiotic, which also proffers a means to resist the patriarchal symbolic repression of polymorphous perversity occasioned by the primary maternal cathexis. Now, I do so because, as is obvious, not only women are poetic or engage the semiotic, and thus that register is available to and regularly employed by men, unless we wish to say that they have thereby ceased being men when they, men, are poetic. Thus we have an example of what I want to call the limits of equivalency. Kristeva offers gay men no theoretical assistance in their own resistance to patriarchal symbolic repression of polymorphous perversity, which of course Freud begins his 3 essays on the theory of sexuality by identifying homosexuals as the most obvious kind of polymorphous perversity that is then repressed, etc., etc. So at the same time, however, Kristeva's project is illustrative to the extent that it exposes certain problematics and interpretivist methodology should take care to avoid repeating. And for the sake of brevity, I followed Butler's outlining of difficulties with her argument, so as to then draw the lessons I find valuable from Butler's critique, so as to then situate them in relation to the methodological style I'm advocating. Butler's main contention is threefold. First, Kristeva characterizes the maternal body as bearing a set of meanings that are prior to culture itself, which, second, effectively reifies the maternal body, while also, third, precluding analysis of the ways in which the maternal body is an effect of certain cultural norms rather than their primary original cause. The point I wish to draw from this reading is simply this. When searching for a set of practices interpretable as specifically gay and male, it is necessary to position these social practices in the context of the cultural dynamism of which they are effects, and which, as such, are thus also affective, always affective. To this extent, synchronicity ceases to be adequate and must give way to an interpretation informed by the historicity of the subjects in question. Precisely because the binding power of certain practices is variable and mutable, an account that situates these micro-shifts in meaning in relation to one another promises greater understanding of those subjects who live by and coalesce an identity around those practices over time. Now it happens that Michael Warner, for instance, has provided a rather useful list of general principles that characterized queer thought before and immediately after Stonewall. His point is to highlight the plurality of concerns and political stances that characterized a queer ethic prior to the normalizing impulses culminating in making marriage rights the national platform governing gay political action. Further, he sounds a skeptical note regarding the plasticity of norms that organize marriage, quipping, quote, "It would seem rather much to expect that gay people would transform the institution of marriage by simply marrying." End quote. Stylistics aside, this is a claim that can be interrogated, just as much as his prior claim that there existed a broader set of socio-political concerns and interests that animated the queer community around the time of Stonewall. Indeed, his principles should be sought after in the daily lived practices of gays living at that time, as should a rich account of how these practices structured and gave meaning to the lives of those subjects who lived them. This analytic technique, I contend, is the first step towards the establishment of a theory of gay male subjectivity. Further, the descriptive and explanatory force of such a methodology is located precisely in its ability to process trace the development and transformation of those practices over time. That is, to be able to posit an account of a gay male tradition, which I find seriously lacking in mainstream gay society. Now, I must close by qualifying my argument, which is to say I want to simply reaffirm some of this essay's guiding intellectual commitments. It is obvious to any casual observer that there is a plurality of gay male subjectivities, even if this turn of phrase isn't invoked as such. It is equally obvious to me. By arguing for a limit of equivalence, or that there exists such a thing, and by challenging gay men to critically explore their own history without succumbing to the subsumption of that analysis to hegemonic discourses, I implicitly acknowledge the differences that emerge under the heading gay male subjectivity. In fact, let's mine that heading and see if it even is still applicable. But of course, until we do such a thing, or do such a thing more thoroughly, in my opinion, it's the shorthand we have. Now, I do not wish to deflate this expansive operation, nor do I think it offers any intellectual traction on otherwise intractable problems. Rather, I wish to position my argument as an explicit call to articulate the historico-culturally specific practices that can be said persuasively to meaningfully organize a particular sociality. Only when this operation is performed, I think, can the very limits of equivalence be overcome, so as to promise a forceful articulation and a public political forum of common interests. Crucially, this isn't a messianic forestalling of such an articulation. Rigorous emphasis on the historicity and discursive embeddedness of any given subject bars the fantastic desire for an overnight revolutionary revaluation of values. Rather, I'm calling for a methodologically sound analysis, capable of providing in real time the theoretical shorthand that would enable certain subjects to navigate the world in which they live at that particular moment. And I should add, to be able to anticipate the changes that such a particular way of life may confront in such a way as to not foreclose possible chains of equivalence, while not at the same time effacing the specificity of certain socialities. Thank you.